The Tonight Show and The Tomorrow Show will each begin 1/2 hour later than usual, so that we may bring you the following NBC News special report.
James Warren Jones, better known as the Reverend Jim Jones. To some, he was a powerful spiritual leader, a good man. At various times, he said he was the reincarnation of Christ and Lenin. His 19-year-old son, Stephen, now sees him this way.
I hate this man for doing what he's done because he has destroyed everything I've lived for.
NBC News reports Jonestown, November 1978. How could it happen? In New York, here is NBC News correspondent Edwin Newman.
Good evening. It's now 4 days since 5 Americans were shot down by other Americans on the airstrip at Port Kaituma, Guyana. One of the dead was Representative Leo Ryan of California. 2 were NBC newsmen, correspondent Don Harris and cameraman Bob Brown. They had gone to investigate a cult called the People's Temple, headed by a man known as the Reverend Jim Jones, and they were killed by members of that cult. Appalling as that was, it did not prepare us for what was to follow. 400 suicides and killings, one of the most astonishing stories of our time, perhaps of any time. Today, there have been these developments. The Guyanese government charged an associate of Jim Jones with the 5 airstrip murders. The first batches of the 409 bodies that were strewn about the People's Temple village in Jonestown, Guyana, were flown out. The search continued for People's Temple members who ran off into the jungle rather than swallow cyanide. And in many parts of the world, the comment was made that the horrible events in Guyana were a reflection of American society. This is what Jonestown looked like yesterday when a group of American airmen arrived there. The airmen wandered about at first, so stunned by what they saw that they were unable to begin identifying and removing the bodies. This morning, most of the bodies still were on the ground, clustered about the tin-roofed main building of the village. At Georgetown, Air Force Starlifted transport planes began unloading. They were carrying helicopters to fly out the bodies and to search for People's Temple members believed to be hiding in the tropical rainforest surrounding Jonestown. The helicopters carried American jungle experts and a graves registration detail. At the courthouse in Georgetown, a man named Larry Layton was formally charged with the murders of Congressman Ryan and the 4 others killed at the Port Kaituma airstrip. 2 other members of the People's Temple have been arrested, but they were not charged today. The government of Guyana did not explain why. The penalty for first-degree murder in Guyana is death by hanging. What prompted Representative Leo Ryan to go to Jonestown in the first place was an appeal from a friend whose son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren were members of the People's Temple. A defector told NBC's Don Harris 2 weeks ago that children often were beaten with paddles and then forced to thank Jim Jones for the beatings. Followers of Jim Jones told Harris that there were no beatings and there was nothing to prevent people from leaving whenever they wanted to. This is what Don Harris and cameraman Bob Brown saw when they arrived. The camp was set in a rainforest, cleared and cultivated by members of the People's Temple. NBC News producer Bob Flick, also in the team, said he never saw any guns until the shooting broke out at the airstrip. Jonestown looked like many other communes, a place where people of different races living in simple dwellings worked together. Don Harris spoke to many Jonestown people. They all insisted that it was a peaceful and productive place in which to live.
Are you happy here?
Oh, I should say I am. I've never been any happier in my life.
You want to stay?
Definitely. I certainly do.
And you girls, what about you?
I love staying here. I'm getting trained in obstetrics. I'm a laboratory technician. I find my work here very fulfilling. I love it here.
I like this place much better, and I won't want to go back there. I just like to be here with the rest of my friends and stuff.
These 2 young women, members of the commune, were being visited by their mother when the NBC News team arrived.
You're happy here?
I'm very happy here. It's the best place I've ever been.
And you?
I wouldn't want to leave here because I have, it's really nice here, and I have, got a good education here and got a lot of friends here. I like it here a lot.
some people have said they couldn't leave if they wanted to. Do you think you could?
Yeah, if I really wanted to, I'm free to go. If I was really wanted to, I'll be able to free to go.
All right, you're their mother. What do you think?
Well, I believe it. I've been here a few days, and I have absolutely no complaints at all. It is really nice here.
This is Jim Jones's mistress, Maria Katsaris. With her is her brother, Anthony, who had come to Jonestown to see whether his sister was living there against her will. Maria committed suicide. Anthony was wounded at the airport.
Are you happy here?
Yes, I'm very happy here.
You know that your father and your brother are convinced that you're not.
Well, I'm very happy here. I don't know what else I can do to convince them. I've talked to my brother several hours now. In fact, I invited him down here about a month and a half ago to spend a week or two or however long he wanted with me, to share with him what I'm doing here and the happiness that I feel. And as far as my father's concerned, you know, so far he has said what he's wanted to say, which has not been the truth.
It must be obvious to you that your brother cares a great deal for you. And I suspect that you have feelings for him. This is a very sad thing. Why does it exist? What can be done to solve this thing where a brother and sister...
There's absolutely no problem between my brother and myself. He's happy, you know, I'm very happy for him to come down here anytime. He's asking me to come back to the United States to spend a week to convince him and my family that I'm not being held here against my will, and I don't plan to return at this time to convince anybody because I know I'm happy here and I know my mind. And, you know, I'm not saying I'm never coming back to the United States, but this is my home here, this is my life for now, and this is where I plan to remain.
You've talked to her, but you're still worried about her. Can you tell me why?
It's hard for me to explain. Last night when I talked to Maria, she said she accused the words that I was saying as being words coming out of my father's mouth. And I said, well, Maria, it's just as hard for me not to know that the words you're saying aren't coming from somebody else's mouth and not yours. That's why I wouldn't, for me to be satisfied, I'd have to see you somewhere else.
The followers of Jim Jones demonstrated their fervent support of their leader at a reception for Congressman Leo Ryan and his delegation.
Very glad to be here. This is a congressional inquiry. I think that all of you know that I'm here to find out more about questions that have been raised about your operation here. But I can tell you right now that from the few conversations I've had with some of the folks here already this evening, that whatever the comments are, there are some people here who believe that this is the best thing that ever happened to them in their whole life.
Many of these people are dead. We don't yet know which ones, but we do know that of the 409 corpses that have been found, more than 80 were children. And despite the exuberance in these scenes, there were signs that some members of the cult wanted to leave. Don Harris presented Jim Jones with just such evidence.
Last night, someone came and passed me this note.
Well, that's who we're talking about. He wants to leave his son here. If Jonestown's such a bad place, why does he want to leave his son here?
Doesn't it concern you, though, that this man, for whatever reason, one of the people in your group...
People play games, friend. They lie, they lie. What can I do about liars? Are you people going to leave us? I just beg you, please leave us. Bill, we will bother nobody. Anybody wants to get out of here can get out of here.
You bring those kids back here!
Hold on a second.
You bring them back!
One second.
Don't you touch my kids!
For those who did leave that day, departure sometimes meant that families were being broken apart. People on their way to an airport massacre, or to death by poison, or if they were lucky, to safety beyond the bounds of Jonestown. I spoke tonight to NBC News correspondent Fred Francis, who's in Guyana and has been to the People's Temple camp. He spoke of the isolation of the place in a dense jungle under a 150-foot canopy, with only a dirt road leading to an airstrip 6 miles away. And he spoke of the dependence of the People's Temple members on Jim Jones for everything: food, shelter, education, everything. Jones, he said, was the all-giving. The psychological dependence of the people on Jones, he said, was total. Perhaps that explains something. But it does not explain everything, and many of the group's supporters in this country are in shock. Charles Gary is the group's lawyer. Don Harris interviewed him last week before they went to Jonestown. Rick Davis interviewed Gary today.
You're convinced Jonestown is a good place?
I think it's a beautiful place. I consider it paradise.
There are no guns in Jonestown.
I have not seen any guns.
Debbie Layton says there is an armed squad, that there are patrols around Jonestown. You say that is not true?
If you go there, you'll find that that's not true. I hope you can go there so that you can see for yourself.
I don't know that I have got the power to forget or forgive. I cannot forget. I cannot forget 409 people who are dead for no reason whatsoever. I cannot forget 80 youngsters who had no choice in being able to live or dying. I cannot ignore that. I cannot condone that. I cannot have history support such a conclusion, even though the man had a tremendous contribution that he's made. I've got to say that he did not do it rationally. He did it in a mad analysis of his own thinking. He was not responsible for what he did. I cannot condone it. No, sir, I cannot. I have not been able to sleep. I just can't handle it.
To understand how what happened at Jonestown could happen, you have to try to understand Jim Jones. NBC News correspondent Rick Davis filed this report.
Jim Jones was born in the small farming community of Lynn, Indiana. He came from an impoverished family. His father was a severely wounded veteran of the First World War. His mother, a Cherokee Indian. High school classmates say Jones was a teenager, always talking about religion. This was the first church of the Reverend Jim Jones in Indianapolis in the 1950s. He had troubles here because of his liberal racial views in a conservative community. But he was appointed director of the city's Human Rights Commission. Father Raymond Bosler served with him.
Well, he was a real tense human being. He was what I would call the Bible Belt type of preacher, and but extremely effective at working with human beings. He had almost a hypnotic power over people that he worked with.
Jones left Indianapolis in 1965. He and his followers started this communal farm in Northern California. It was a community that welcomed all races, but there were questions about welfare fraud here and the land Jones was getting from some believers. No charges were filed against Jones, and soon he was moving again. He opened a temple in San Francisco, and this temple opened in Los Angeles. Jones was called a man of miracles. His temples offered free medical care and free legal advice. People joined by the thousands. They seemed to worship Jones as much as they did God. But what did this man have? Dr. Carlton Goodlett is a medical doctor with a degree in psychology, a newspaper publisher, and he was a backer of Jim Jones.
Those who've been crying out for help, he helped. Those who were ex-prisoners, those who were pimps, prostitutes, drug addicts, they found refuge there. And he took people whose lives were down so low down, didn't bother them. And I said to members of the black religious community that there's a message to be learned in the type of Christianity this man is speaking.
But some were leaving the church in anger and disgust. We will not identify this woman. You will not see her clearly. She fears reprisals.
He gave them a very, very strong religious belief. You know, I mean, sure, he had animals, he had swimming pools, he had all of that. But he told them, I am God. I lived with Jesus. Jesus wasn't any good. You know, he was a wino. We drank together. You know, these are the things he told them. And he gave them to believe that you shouldn't have relationships with your husband, have them with me through my picture, and all of this kind of stuff, you know. What? This is what he told them. He told them to use his picture and have a relationship.
And Jones seemed to be fascinated by his own pictures. They filled the pages of the People's Temple newspaper. He liked to help and be seen with politicians. This is California Lieutenant Governor Mervyn Dimely. This is Jim Jones shaking hands with San Francisco Mayor George Moscone. One state senator got the legislature to issue a proclamation praising the humanitarian efforts of Jim Jones. Now, most politicians don't want to talk about their relationship with Jones. But Mayor Moscone will talk. He appointed Jones president of the San Francisco Housing Authority.
I appointed somebody who had a reputation as a peacemaker in this city, who had worked with poor people and people in frustration, whose reputation was that you do not resort to violent means, you deal with reason and persuasion.
Moscone will suffer politically, and today he suffered as he wept at the funeral of his close friend, Congressman Leo Ryan. About a year ago, Jim Jones left San Francisco. He went to the People's Temple Agricultural Mission he had established in Guyana. That was about the same time ex-Temple members were telling their stories to the news media, and the district attorney was conducting an investigation of charges of fraud and brutality in the temple. And the pictures came back from Guyana, smiling faces and word that this was the promised land. In one pamphlet, there is this line, "Where there is no vision, the people perish."
There had been defections from the People's Temple, members who became disenchanted with the Reverend Jim Jones and his excesses, and they formed a kind of community in Berkeley, California. They were frightened by Jones, and they still are frightened by Jones.
If Jim Jones is dead, the church is dead.
The church is dead without Jim Jones, no doubt in my mind whatsoever. Because I don't think that
many former members of the People's Temple don't believe that Reverend Jim Jones is dead. They are still looking for proof.
The picture we saw on television last night could have been anybody.
Wayne Pietola says Jim Jones was capable of making it look as though he'd been killed. Pietola, once one of Jones' bodyguards, explained.
In 1973, on a trip back east, dyed my hair, put on clothes just like Jones, and entered meetings that we were having back there posing as Jones. And as other people that were there can attest, people thought I was Jim Jones.
Why? Former members of the People's Temple are scared, they say, because Jim Jones arranged for his followers to assassinate people who left the church. Neva Sly thinks her husband Don is one of the assassins.
I read in the paper that my husband Don Sly is the one that put the knife to Congressman Ryan's throat. He and the rest of the men on that squad, or women, are dedicated totally to what they have been asked to do, and that is to assassinate the defectors.
Mrs. Sly and many other former members of the People's Temple have relatives and friends whose bodies were identified at the settlement in Guyana. Mrs. Sly's son, Mark, is dead. Those once faithful to Reverend Jim Jones are being asked over and over about why Jones was so powerful and how he could hold people in his control. There are no simple answers.
I know that what's happened to people is not easy for you to understand, how people could do things under brainwashing, and really, until you've experienced it, you can't explain it. It's just...
It seems, according to many of these people who once participated in a Jones suicide hoax, that the only reason the People's Temple prospered was because of Jones himself. These people say he had answers for every question and explanations for every answer. And even now, they are scared. And some don't believe that Jim Jones is dead. Bill Sternoff, NBC News, San Francisco.
What happened in Guyana was unimaginable until it happened. Even now, the madness of Jim Jones and the People's Temple is almost impossible to understand. We do not in any way want to equate any other group with the madness of Jonestown. But there has been a disturbing growth in the cult phenomenon in this country. As different as other groups are from the People's Temple, some have their own chilling practices, and we have an obligation to understand them. Membership in cults began to increase dramatically during the late 1960s. Today, there are 3,000 cults in this country alone, with 8 million members. It appears that cults arise at times when the structure of society is breaking down. But cult followers are not necessarily outcasts or misfits in that society.
The recruitment techniques are so sophisticated that almost any one of us could be captured by the approach of various cults.
Some physicians say the cults are dangerous to the physical and emotional health of the believers.
I believe these sects and cults are really mini-fascist organizations in action. They use terroristic means of intimidation in order to force their members to adopt a certain philosophy, a certain way of life, and a certain way of thinking. And they therefore take away all possible freedom of the individual, and people who join out of love and out of a need for belonging wind up haters and fighters against other groups.
There are literally hundreds of thousands of people out there in a state of mind resembling the Manson family, and all they need is a similar command of their leader, like Charles Manson, who could be called a cult leader, to murder, to kill, and we would have that kind of criminal and violent situation on our hands in this country.
Producer Pat Lynch spoke with members of 40 of the largest cults. Terry Shervin told her about a West Coast cult to which he belonged for a year.
The first night I was allowed no sleep whatsoever. I did not have any dinner and was not allowed to eat at all. I was battered from approximately 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening until 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And after about 1 or 2 hours of sleep, I was awakened with a constant chanting kind of mantra prayer that they use. And throughout that whole night and into the early part of the next day, I just lost my will to fight back.
Gary Scharf was chief lecturer and recruiter for one of the largest cults.
Our love, Father. This is where we must face the problems of this age, Father, in our hearts, Father.
So your life is totally consumed and your privacy is totally exhausted by an external authority that uses you for its own ends.
Steve Hassan was a cult leader and lecturer for 2.5 years.
I found myself lying. I found myself withholding letters from members in my center. I found myself listening in on phone conversations, lying in proselytizing and fundraising in so many different aspects.
Erica Heftman, cult membership, 1.5 years.
Under brainwashing, you lose a complete sense of conscience and judgment, and you're encouraged to be completely honest with your leaders, but the double standard also requires you to deceive the public and your parents and follow any command to even kill your parents.
Pat Egger says that the cult to which she belonged for 5.5 years prayed for the death of people they did not like.
He had such control over the group that he could actually get them to a point of praying for people's death, like David Rockefeller at one time.
This man does not want his identity revealed. He stole from his parents and volunteered to kill the President of the United States.
And you would have stolen from your parents, killed your parents.
I did steal from my parents, and I think I would have killed my parents. And I told her that if there was any kind of a plan to get rid of Nixon, that I would be happy to be involved in it. But I said that I would be glad to shoot him.
If God is an all-powerful God,
Former members of cults are their harshest critics. Gary Scharf.
People in our society who aren't familiar with the problem don't have any idea of just how dangerous it is, because people are having their freedom extracted from them. People are becoming totally controlled by a leader who has no restrictions upon his behavior. It's dangerous to the young people involved, and it's dangerous to the world as a whole.
What is the job of the United States government in dealing with cults? Should the FBI have known something and done something about the People's Temple? We put that question to NBC News correspondent Carl Stern.
No concerted effort was ever made by the FBI to find out what was happening in the People's Temple. Agents put part of the blame on guidelines imposed a few years ago, limiting investigations only to the most violent and dangerous groups, about 15 altogether. Insufficient complaints had been received about the temple to put it in that category. Now there's an air of "I told you so" from agents who think the limitations on investigations have been too severe. The fact is, an outfit like the People's Temple could appear tomorrow and still not meet the criteria for FBI scrutiny. The FBI is investigating the People's Temple now, after the fact. It wants to learn more about those arrested or facing arrest in Guyana for the shooting of Congressman Ryan. A Justice Department memo says those arrested could be prosecuted in the U.S., even though the crime occurred elsewhere. But most of the early warnings about the temple, serious enough to prompt an investigation, never reached the FBI. They went instead to the State Department. What the State Department did or didn't do, reported now by Andrea Mitchell.
The State Department had been warned as early as last spring by former Jonestown residents that cult leader Jim Jones was preaching mass suicide and threatening to kill any members who wanted to leave.
We had heard reports of a suicide pact. On the other hand, I'm not sure what the proper action of U.S. officials are.
The State Department received 1,200 letters about the People's Temple. They say 70% were favorable. But this sworn statement from a former cult member said Jones was conducting mass suicide drills. Officers in the field checked the complaints by interviewing 75 Jonestown residents. They say not one confirmed the charges or accepted the embassy's offer to be escorted to safety. As a result, families back home were told the people appear healthy, adequately fed and housed, and satisfied with their lives on what is a large farm. Congressman Leo Ryan was not satisfied with the rosy picture being painted by the Georgetown embassy.
The reports that obviously came back from our people were not accurate as to the real nature of the problem at Jonestown, and we had been asking them for over a year for information and trying to dig it out. The State Department, and we had been getting reports that there was no real problem and that was exaggerated. In view of the subsequent events which have now happened, it is obvious that they did not know of everything that was going on in that community. The Consular Service of the United States is not inherently an investigative organization.
The International Relations Committee, on which Congressman Ryan served, wants some answers from the State Department. They want to know whether early warnings were dismissed too lightly. Officials here say that there are Americans living in religious groups like the People's Temple all over the world.
I think we're all reluctant to question the beliefs and practices of other religious organizations, some of which very few of us understand.
So if a similar situation arose again, the State Department's response would probably be the same. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News, the State Department.
Well, there for the moment, the story stands. It has, of course, provoked much comment abroad. TASS, the Soviet news agency, calls what happened in Guyana a symptom of an inhumane society. A Tokyo columnist asked, is there something hidden in California that brings about lunacy? Papers in Stockholm and Munich asked the same question. A paper in Cologne, West Germany, suggested that the problem might be that in the United States, strange sects are protected by constitutional guarantees. Some of the countries that are now freely commenting have had horrors of their own to answer for, some of them monumental, but there is not much comfort in that. This was American cultism, and this was Americans killing other Americans and themselves. In its own interest, for its own well-being, this nation will have to find out why. Edwin Newman, NBC News.
This has been a special report from NBC News.
This is the NBC Television Network.